Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Mere Finance. And today we're going to talk about private debt, how it's overlooked, and how it should be an essential indicator for economic development and also for macro investment. So stay tuned, don't forget to subscribe, and let's start. What we see usually is that political candidates, political pundits, government officials, they always talk about debt and debt and debt. And usually all what we care is government debt. But in reality, private debt is usually overlooked and should be the most important aspect to look when investing at the macro level. So usually government, they don't have much constraints. They can print money using their central bank and just print money with their currency. Of course, they have constraints like inflation, credibility, their tax base, political stability, but they can really just print money of thinner. Private debt, though, is credit quality dependent. They have so many constraints, lines of credit, ability to generate income and revenue, business cycles, etc., etc. So private debt, for the lack of a better word, is actually backed by economic output versus government debt. So that's why it's more important, because it actually shows the real economy. So here is a graph from a professor that I mentioned down in the comments for this video. So his chart is basically the private sector credit percentage of GDP for Japan, Thailand, Spain, and China throughout the years. See how it bursts from an all-time high, just goes down, and we're going to see what happens when private debt just bursts as a percentage of GDP. So for example, Japan, in the 1980s, there was a real leverage in the private real estate market. We can always go back and see that most billionaires in the world were Japanese in the 80s. So in the top 10, top 20 were Japanese, because usually their fortunes were also invested in real estate, and the real estate was valued at absorbently high prices. So the Imperial Palace of Tokyo was worth more than California, as Japan had approximately like a 200% of private sector to debt GDP ratio. Then the Bank of Japan raised rates and the bubble burst. Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger always say that leverage, liquor, and women will destroy every empire. I don't know if I'm a woman, but definitely leverage. When you are over leveraged, you can just go belly up really fast. So this has an implication until today in Japan. They're still recovering from this bubble burst, and they're in constant deflation because the system keeps trying to deleverage itself. So back to the chart, we can see Thailand, for example. Thailand in the 90s had a surreal economic growth. The Asian tigers, the Vietnam, the Thailands, those ones, they had more than 10% on annualized basis, but everything came from private sector leverage. That's why also on leverage beta in the private markets, when you are looking at a business or different companies, it should be key to review the unleveraged beta, because you can actually improve your numbers financially speaking by just issuing more debt. It makes you more profitable. We actually should look at unleveraged beta, which actually looks at how you're doing without leverage, in this case debt. Spain had another important contribution to our analysis, because in the 2000s, when the Eurozone and the European Union was created, the Eurobloc, which is the economic body of the European Union, they created what we call the Maastricht 30 debt. So basically, it conveyed all the rules and regulation and ratios for government debt. So you wanted to apply to be part of the Eurobloc, you had to have a certain government debt ratio to GDP, but it never touched upon the private debts. So private debt soared, and then household debt also. So when it exploded, it brought the housing market down and then a huge deleveraging ensues. So we can see here in this graph, look at the red line from corporate, which is basically private debt, how it goes all the way up in the 2012, and then it just like crumbles. Government debt, because it got into the euro block, trended down, so they did a good job there, but the private debt just soared, and you can see how household debt just went bananas up as well, probably because leveraging too much in the housing market. So same, we're going to see in China. This is not a prediction, this actually is happening already. The private sector to debt is over 200% in debt to GDP, and you can see that Evergrande, which is the biggest real estate developer, just collapsed. So most of the leverage usually comes also, you can see the first part that collapses is the real estate, so it's actually happening. So we'll have to monitor in the next years, but we probably will see that China also has a deep leveraging time where rough economic conditions will occur. You always see high unemployment in the youth for China, and as populations start declining, I think China could potentially become another Japan, but of course they have more influence in the world, so they probably will have a more diversified economy, but their private sector to debt to GDP is extremely high. So in conclusion, the private sector debt offers much better hints about leveraging vulnerabilities than government debt, and usually private sectors can really bring down the whole economy. And for example, the virtuous countries, the Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, the Norway, the Denmark, they have really great government balance sheets, so they don't have too much debt in comparison to their GDP from a government perspective, but their private markets are pretty leveraged. And like the US, they have done horrible in government debt since George Bush and the Iraq war. You can see just the numbers exploding. It got accelerated during the Trump's presidency because of coronavirus incentives. So you have like a annualized deficit of $1 trillion per year for the last 6 years, at least. But the private debt to GDP is around 150%. So it's still not as high as government debt, but still pretty high. So when you see everything collapsing, the first thing you have to look is housing, because housing is where usually private debt comes from. So usually households, their biggest asset is their house. So that's when you start seeing the cracks in the whole economy. That's why housing is such a key component. So just wanted to provide this, that we have to also look into private debt because it's a more excellent indicator. So let us know what you think. Don't forget to subscribe, give us a like, share, and we'll see you in another episode of Mere Finance. Thank you.